When a desperate single mother brought her 5-year-old daughter to her high-stakes corporate job, she was simply trying to survive a Tuesday. She never expected her little girl to wander into the path of Chicago's most ruthless crime boss, nor did she anticipate the chilling, life-altering proposal that immediately followed. Clara Higgins did not have the luxury of a safety net. At 28, she was a single mother, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Bridgeport, Chicago. Her days were a meticulously scheduled balancing act of dropping her 5-year-old daughter, Lily, at preschool, catching the L train, and working grueling hours as a senior client coordinator at Crestview Executive Concierge. Crestview wasn't a standard customer service job. It catered to billionaires, foreign dignitaries, and the ultra-wealthy elite who demanded the impossible on a daily basis. On a biting Tuesday morning in late November, the fragile house of cards Clara had built suddenly collapsed. Her regular babysitter, Mrs. Gable, contracted severe influenza. Clara had already used her final sick day the month prior when Lily had a fever. Her strict supervisor, Richard Sterling, had made it abundantly clear that any further absences would result in immediate termination. Clara looked down at Lily, who was clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit, and made a desperate choice. "You are going to be Mommy's special assistant today, Bug," Clara whispered, hastily packing a tote bag with coloring books, an iPad, and 3 types of snacks. By 9 a.m., Clara had smuggled Lily into the Crestview offices, hiding her in a secluded corner cubicle near the break room. For the first few hours, the plan worked flawlessly. Lily sat quietly, headphones over her ears, deeply engrossed in her cartoons, while Clara fielded frantic calls from European investors needing private jets chartered to Aspen. Then, the atmosphere in the office shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, suffocating silence that descended upon the entire floor. The usual hum of keyboards and ringing phones ceased. Clara peered over the frosted glass of her partition. Standing by the reception desk were 4 men in immaculate, tailored dark suits. They didn't look like the usual tech billionaires or real estate tycoons that frequented Crestview. There was a dangerous, predatory stillness to them. At the center stood Daniel Russo. Publicly, Daniel was the enigmatic CEO of Russo Enterprises, a logistics and real estate empire that owned half the shipping ports on the East Coast. Privately, and within the terrified whispers of the city's underground, he was the newly ascended head of the Chicago Commission, a ruthless syndicate boss who had recently purged his rivals in a silent, bloodless coup. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes the color of forged steel. Clara watched, heart pounding, as Richard Sterling practically sprinted out of his glass office, sweating profusely. "Mr. Russo, an absolute honor. We weren't expecting. I need the deed to the Astor property by 5 o'clock today," Daniel interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded the room. "The current owner is refusing to sell. Make him change his mind. Legally, of course." The last part was said with a subtle, chilling irony. As Sterling stammered, trying to explain that a multi-million-dollar real estate acquisition couldn't be legally bullied into existence in 6 hours, Clara heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Thump. 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 Lily's brightly colored bouncy ball had escaped the cubicle. Clara gasped, dropping her headset, but she was too late. Lily, entirely unbothered by the terrifying silence in the room, crawled out from under the desk, chasing the neon green ball as it rolled directly across the Italian marble floor and bumped against the polished toe of Daniel Russo's custom Oxford shoe. The entire office held its collective breath. One of Daniel's bodyguards, a massive man with a scarred jaw named Silvio, instinctively moved his hand toward the inside of his jacket. Lily stood up, smoothing down her denim overalls, and looked up at the towering Mafia boss. "Excuse me, mister. You're stepping on Mr. Bouncy." Clara scrambled out of the cubicle, her face flushed with absolute terror. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry," she breathed out, rushing forward to grab Lily's hand. "She's not supposed to be here. Please, excuse us." Daniel raised a single hand, a silent command that froze Clara in her tracks. He didn't look angry. Instead, his piercing steel eyes studied the fearless 5-year-old, and then slowly drifted to Clara. He took in her frayed nerves, the ink smudges on her cuffs, and the fierce, protective way she had placed her body between him and the child. Slowly, the ruthless syndicate boss crouched down to Lily's eye level. He picked up the neon green ball in his large, scarred hand and held it out. "Mr. Bouncy is very fast," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lily giggled, taking the ball. "He is. Do you want a sticker for finding him?" Without waiting for an answer, Lily peeled a holographic dinosaur sticker off her hand and slapped it directly onto the lapel of Daniel Russo's $4,000 suit. Silvio choked on a gasp. Richard Sterling looked as though he might faint. Daniel looked down at the dinosaur sticker, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a shadow of a smile. He stood back up to his full, intimidating height, his eyes locking onto Clara's terrified gaze. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Clara. Clara Higgins, sir," she stammered. Daniel turned his head slightly towards Sterling. "Sterling, this woman is handling my account today. If she gets me the Astor deed by 5 o'clock, you double her salary. If she fails, I burn this entire firm to the ground. Have a productive day." With that, Daniel turned and strode out of the office, his bodyguards trailing behind. And there, stuck to the lapel of the most dangerous man in Chicago, was a holographic T-Rex. The next 6 hours were a masterclass in desperation. Clara, fueled by maternal adrenaline and the very real threat of Daniel Russo, dug into the files of the Astor Properties owner, utilizing every loophole, leveraging every contact, and uncovering a zoning violation that the owner desperately wanted kept hidden. Clara managed the impossible. By 4:45 p.m., she had secured the signed agreement. Rather than sending a courier, Daniel's right-hand man, Silvio, arrived at the office to escort Clara directly to Russo's private estate in Lake Forest to deliver the documents in person. Clara had arranged for Mrs. Gable, who was feeling slightly better, to watch Lily for the evening, ensuring she was safe at home. The Russo estate was less a home and more a fortress, guarded by high iron gates and men with cold, watchful eyes. Inside, the opulence was staggering. Clara was led to a massive, dimly lit mahogany library where Daniel stood pouring a glass of amber scotch. He reviewed the documents in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "You are resourceful, Clara Higgins. Most men in your firm would have given up by noon. You fought like a cornered wolf. I am a mother, Mr. Russo. I don't have the luxury of giving up," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Daniel stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming. "I respect survival. I want you working for me. Exclusively. A private consultant for Russo Enterprises. Triple what Crestview pays you. Full benefits. And security for your child." It was an offer that would change her life. But working directly for a known criminal terrifyingly blurred the lines of morality. Clara asked for 24 hours to consider, to which Daniel simply nodded, handing her a black business card with a single, private phone number on it. But Clara's life was not destined for a peaceful transition. When she returned to her Bridgeport apartment that night, the front door was ajar. The lock had been splintered. Panic seizing her throat, Clara rushed in to find Mrs. Gable cowering in the kitchen, holding a crying Lily. Standing in the center of the trashed living room was Brandon Miller. Brandon was Clara's ex-husband, a man who had walked out on her when Lily was barely a year old, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of gambling debts and a broken lease. He looked worse than ever, gaunt, frantic, and sweating profusely. "Where is it, Clara?" Brandon yelled, grabbing her by the arms as she lunged to check on Lily. "I know you're holding out. Word on the street is you were seen getting into a car with Silvio from the Russo family today. You're working for the mob now? You have money." "Let go of me, Brandon. I don't have anything," Clara screamed, pushing him away. "You don't understand." Brandon's eyes were wild with a feral, desperate terror. "I owe Carlo Moretti 500 grand, Clara. The Moretti family is coming for me. I told them my ex-wife is tight with Daniel Russo now. I told them you'd pay my debt, or they could take you instead." Clara's blood turned to ice. Carlo Moretti was the volatile, violent head of the South Side Syndicate, the very family Daniel Russo had been systematically destroying. Brandon had just painted a massive target on her and her daughter's backs. Before Clara could dial 911, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. 3 men shoved their way into the tiny apartment. They weren't police. They carried suppressed handguns, their faces grim. The Morettis had followed Brandon. Well, ain't this a cozy little family reunion? The lead thug sneered, grabbing Brandon by the hair and tossing him against the wall. He turned his dead eyes toward Clara and Lily. Mr. Moretti wants a word with Russo's new pet. Clara shielded Lily with her body, a primal scream trapped in her throat. She slid her hand into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the heavy, embossed cardstock of the black business card Daniel had given her. She blindly pressed the buttons on her phone inside her pocket, dialing the number from memory and hitting send, praying the line was open. Please, Clara begged, projecting her voice over the phone line hidden in her pocket. My name is Clara. You don't have to do this. The Morettis don't want a war over me in my Bridgeport apartment. The thug laughed, racking the slide of his pistol. Russo ain't here to save you, sweetheart. Suddenly, the apartment window shattered inward. A hail of precise, suppressed gunfire erupted from the fire escape outside, dropping 2 of the Moretti men instantly. The front door was kicked completely off its hinges. Silvio and 4 heavily armed Russo enforcers flooded the room. The remaining Moretti thug dropped his weapon, raising his hands in sheer terror before he was swiftly knocked unconscious by Silvio. Brandon was sobbing on the floor in a puddle of his own making. The chaotic noise settled into an eerie, ringing silence. The men parted, making way for a tall silhouette, stepping through the ruined doorway. Daniel Russo stepped into the cramped, broken apartment. He didn't look at the bodies, nor did he look at the pathetic, whimpering Brandon. His cold, steel eyes found Clara, who was on the floor, clutching Lily to her chest, shaking violently. Daniel slowly knelt beside them, pulling a custom silk handkerchief from his pocket and gently wiping a stray smear of dirt from Lily's cheek. The little girl wasn't crying. She stared at Daniel in awe. Daniel stood up, looking down at Clara. The mask of the businessman was gone. The ruthless syndicate boss remained. You called me, Daniel stated, his voice a dark, velvet rumble in the ruined room. I didn't know what else to do, Clara whispered, tears finally spilling over. He owes them money. They're going to come back. They're going to kill us. Daniel looked at Brandon, his gaze holding an executioner's finality, before looking back at Clara. No, they won't, Daniel said calmly. Because the Moretti family is dead by sunrise. He reached out, his large hand gently gripping Clara's chin, forcing her to look up into his unyielding eyes. I told you I protect what is mine, Clara. Working for me isn't enough to keep the wolves away anymore. They think you are a pawn they can use against me. Daniel's thumb brushed lightly over her trembling lower lip. There is only one way to make you untouchable in my world. Only one way to ensure no one ever looks at you or your daughter with anything less than absolute fear and respect. Clara's breath hitched. What are you saying? I am saying, Daniel murmured, the weight of his words sealing her fate, that you are going to marry me. The morning after the attack on her Bridgeport apartment, Clara awoke in a bed that cost more than her college education. The sheets were Egyptian cotton. The room was vast and bathed in the pale light of a Lake Forest dawn, and outside her oak door stood 2 armed men in tailored charcoal suits. She was no longer just Clara Higgins, senior client coordinator. She was the fiancée of Daniel Russo. Daniel had moved with terrifying efficiency. Before sunrise, Clara's meager belongings were packed. Her lease was paid off in full by a shell corporation, and Brandon, her ex-husband, was quietly relocated to a rehabilitation facility in Nevada, with strict orders never to return to Illinois. Carlo Moretti, the man who had ordered the hit, was found dead in his warehouse near the Navy Pier, an apparent victim of a sudden, violent turf war. Breakfast was served in the estate's solarium. Lily was already there, happily eating silver-dollar pancakes while showing Silvio, the massive, scarred bodyguard, how to correctly color a unicorn. Silvio looked utterly out of his depth but was dutifully shading the mane with a pink crayon. Daniel entered, dressed in a flawless Brioni suit, projecting an aura of absolute authority. He dismissed the staff with a nod and sat opposite Clara. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the mahogany table. Your new employment contract, Daniel stated, his steel eyes unreadable. And our prenup. Clara opened it. The numbers printed on the heavy stock paper were astronomical. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the stipulations. The terms of the arrangement. Asterisk public appearances. Clara must attend all high-level corporate galas, charity dinners, and syndicate gatherings by Daniel's side to project absolute stability. Asterisk. Security protocol. Clara and Lily are never to leave the Lake Forest estate without a minimum of 2 Russo security personnel. Asterisk financial independence. Clara will receive a monthly stipend of $50,000, deposited into a private offshore account, and a trust fund will be established at Goldman Sachs for Lily's education and future. Asterisk. Duration. The marriage will last a minimum of 3 years. After that, Clara may choose to leave with full financial backing and a new identity, or renegotiate the terms. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she looked up from the document. "You saved us. You didn't have to marry me. You could have just hired me as a consultant like you originally said." Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The distance between them felt electric. "The commission, the governing body of the 5 families in Chicago, is fracturing. They view me as a wild card. A young, unmarried boss who takes what he wants and kills who he pleases is bad for business. They want stability. They want a family man. By marrying you, a legitimate, hard-working corporate woman with a child, I create an impenetrable facade of respectability." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as it flicked to Lily. "And practically speaking, it is the only way to ensure the remaining dregs of the Moretti family never dare to look in your direction again. As my wife, an attack on you is a declaration of war against the entire Russo empire." Clara took a deep breath, picking up the gold-plated Montblanc pen beside the folder. She wasn't an idiot. She was a mother playing a high-stakes game of chess, and Daniel Russo had just offered her the queen. She signed her name on the dotted line. Over the next 2 months, Clara was thrust into a world of unimaginable wealth and suffocating danger. She was fitted for couture gowns on Michigan Avenue, adorned in diamonds from Harry Winston, and introduced to politicians, real estate tycoons, and ruthless capos who kissed her hand while assessing her worth. Through it all, Daniel was a brilliant, terrifying enigma. In public, he played the role of the devoted fiancé flawlessly, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, his eyes dark with feigned adoration. But in the quiet moments of the estate, the lines began to blur. He started returning home early to read Lily bedtime stories, his deep, gravelly voice surprisingly suited for fairy tales. He bought Lily a purebred Holland Lop Rabbit, which she promptly named Mr. Bouncy II, and late at night, in the dim light of his study, Daniel would discuss his legitimate business strategies with Clara. He respected her sharp corporate mind, utilizing her ruthless efficiency to restructure his legal holdings. Clara realized, with a creeping sense of panic, that she was falling in love with a monster who treated her like a queen. But the illusion of safety was about to violently shatter. The Moretti syndicate had not been completely eradicated. Carlo's younger brother, Antonio Moretti, had survived Daniel's purge by hiding in Canada, and Antonio was not acting alone. Someone inside Clara's world had been feeding the Morettis information from the very beginning. It started with small discrepancies. While reviewing the financial ledgers for Russo Enterprises' recent acquisition of the Astor property, Clara noticed a recurring anomaly, a series of wire transfers disguised as administrative fees, routed through offshore accounts. Utilizing the forensic accounting skills she had honed at Crestview Executive Concierge, Clara traced the dummy corporations. The money wasn't going to the Morettis. It was going to Richard Sterling, Clara's former boss. Sterling had been laundering money for the Moretti family through Crestview's elite client accounts for years. When Clara had miraculously secured the Astor deed for Daniel on that fateful Tuesday, she had unwittingly put Russo Enterprises' pristine finances in direct contact with Sterling's corrupted ecosystem. Sterling, terrified that Clara's meticulous eyes would eventually catch his embezzlement, had tipped off Brandon and the Morettis about her location, hoping to have her eliminated before she could expose him. Clara immediately printed the damning ledgers, intending to show Daniel as soon as he returned from a meeting downtown. But before she could leave the study, the heavy oak doors burst open. It wasn't Daniel. It was Richard Sterling, sweating profusely, flanked by 3 men wearing tactical gear and carrying suppressed submachine guns. Antonio Moretti's hit squad had bypassed the estate's outer security. "Hello, Clara," Sterling said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and malice. "You always were too smart for your own good." Clara's maternal instincts erupted into pure, unfiltered adrenaline. Lily was upstairs in the playroom with Mrs. Gable, the nanny Daniel had thoroughly vetted and hired full-time. Clara needed to keep these men away from the second floor at all costs. "Richard," Clara said, her voice eerily calm as she stood up, subtly sweeping the printed ledgers into the open safe behind the desk and locking it with a sharp twist of the dial. "You're making a monumental mistake. Daniel will peel the skin from your bones. Daniel is currently trapped in a lockdown at the Palmer House Hotel," Sterling sneered, wiping his brow. "Antonio's men initiated a bomb threat. He's surrounded by SWAT. By the time he gets back, you'll be a tragic casualty of a home invasion. And I will have my money." "Where is the safe code, sweetheart?" one of the hitmen growled, stepping forward and pressing the cold muzzle of his rifle against Clara's temple. "Sterling says there's 10 million in untraceable bearer bonds in there." Clara's mind raced. Daniel had taught her the estate's security protocols during her first week. The study was soundproof, but the silent panic button wasn't under the desk, it was disguised as a bronze paperweight on the bookshelf. "The code is biometric," Clara lied smoothly, mirroring the cold, calculated detachment she had seen Daniel use 100 times. "It requires my thumbprint and a physical key. The key is on the bookshelf." The hitman shoved her forward. "Get it. No sudden moves." Clara walked slowly toward the bookshelf. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around the heavy bronze paperweight. She didn't just press it. She gripped it tightly. Suddenly, the massive bay windows of the study exploded inward in a shower of shattered glass and splintered wood. Daniel hadn't been trapped at the Palmer house. He had sniffed out the diversion. Silvio and 2 other enforcers rappelled down from the roof, instantly dropping 2 of Antonio's hitmen with lethal precision. The room devolved into absolute chaos. Gunfire deafened Clara as she threw herself to the Persian rug, covering her head. The 3rd hitman, realizing they were outgunned, panicked, and aimed his weapon wildly toward Clara. "Clara!" a voice roared. Daniel vaulted over the mahogany desk, moving with terrifying speed. He tackled Clara to the floor, just as the hitman fired. Clara heard a sickening thud and felt Daniel's massive body jerk violently above her. Silvio's weapon barked twice. The final hitman dropped dead. Richard Sterling, realizing his complete failure, dropped to his knees, sobbing and pleading for his life. Silvio grabbed him by the collar, dragging him out of the room without a word. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ringing in Clara's ears and the sound of ragged breathing. "Daniel!" Clara gasped, pushing herself up. Daniel was slumped against the ruined desk, his hand pressing hard against his left side. Dark, thick blood was rapidly soaking through his crisp white shirt. His face was pale, but his steel eyes were locked onto hers, frantically searching for injuries. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice strained. No, I'm fine," Clara sobbed, ripping off her silk scarf and pressing it fiercely against his wound. "You took a bullet for me. You idiot! You took a bullet!" Daniel reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently cupping her face. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. "It is my job to protect what is mine, Clara." "You don't have to pretend right now," she cried, applying more pressure to the wound as she screamed for the estate's private medical team. "The contract doesn't cover taking bullets, Daniel." "Damn the contract," Daniel breathed out, his eyes fluttering as the blood loss took its toll. "I tore it up weeks ago. You aren't a facade, Clara. You're my wife. You're my family." He lost consciousness, just as the paramedics stormed into the room. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile hospital corridors and heavy security details. Clara refused to leave the private wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She sat in the stiff armchair beside Daniel's bed, holding his hand, while Lily slept curled up on the small sofa nearby. During that time, Clara didn't just wait. She acted. She used Daniel's secured phone to contact his lieutenants. She distributed the ledgers, proving Sterling's betrayal, officially neutralizing the remaining Moretti threat by exposing their financial pipelines to the Commission. She proved that she wasn't just a figurehead. She was the formidable matriarch of the Russo family. When Daniel finally opened his eyes on the third day, the first thing he saw was Clara. She looked exhausted, her hair a mess, wearing a wrinkled sweater, but to him, she had never looked more beautiful. "You're awake," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek as she squeezed his hand. Daniel's grip tightened around hers. "I hear you've been running my empire while I was asleep. Someone had to ensure the stock portfolios didn't tank," Clara replied, a watery smile breaking through. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "Don't ever do that again." "I can't promise that," Daniel murmured, his voice weak but his resolve absolute. "I love you, Clara. There is no fake marriage. There is only you, me, and Lily. Forever." Clara closed her eyes, finally letting go of the fear she had carried for so long. She leaned down and kissed him, sealing a vow that no legal document could ever enforce. In the end, Clara realized that love doesn't always arrive in a conventional package. Sometimes, it comes wrapped in danger, dressed in a bespoke suit, and fiercely protective of those it claims. She had brought her daughter to work merely hoping to survive the day, but she walked away as the untouchable queen of Chicago's underworld, finally finding a terrifying, yet profoundly beautiful and unyielding, forever.